if someone at a convention, for example, comes up and wants book signed or mentions a story that I did, there are about 3 or 4 stories that get mentioned more than any others.
Can I
And the
guess what they
Frog
are?
story, sure.
Is it
Do you want to guess?
Frog Thor, Beta Ray Bill,
Yep.
Surtur, Ragnarok and
Well,
Roll?
Sterner in general, but that's like a long saga. So I'm thinking of the little chapters, the 2 or 3 episodes
It's
I was doing to those
yeah,
guys.
it's the one where Loki goes for myself after Thor goes
Well,
for
that
Midgard.
panel gets mentioned more than say the issue. But yes,
Oh,
that
okay.
panel is a lot of people's favorite panel. But there are 2 other stories that people will, if they're mentioning stories, that they will mention to me more than others.
Is it He Stood Alone at Gallerbrew?
Yes, that's one of them. The other you might or might not guess. You have to be pretty familiar with the material, I think. But I believe it was Kurt Busiek's favorite story of the ones I did in the book.
Is it? Oh man. Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. I believe this is the first time I'm going to say this. Someone an asteroid is named after.
It's true.
Asteroid 53237. I only know of one other comics creator that has had an asteroid named after him. How are you today, Mr. Walt Simonson?
I am just fine. I have to say, I'm still stunned that there's an asteroid out there with my name on it.
Do you have any backstory as to how that came about?
No, it just I apparently somebody who was naming asteroids or found it. I don't know how that works in the asteroid business. It may be that it's like in fossils. If you find the fossils and describe a dinosaur in a scientific paper, you get to name it. Is more or less how it works. And so whether it was the discoverer of the asteroid that named it, and there are gazillions of asteroids, how that worked exactly, I can only assume, because there are a few other Simonsons around in history, but it was for me. I can only assume that whoever named it must have been a comics fan. So I was enormously flattered.
Undoubtedly. Speaking of
I'm
the
also
other,
very impressed. I'm impressed that you know about it.
it's on your Wikipedia, actually.
Oh, well,
But
I have nothing to do with that. You know, I think I wouldn't be allowed to alter anyway. I think if it's an entry about you can't get in there and fiddle with it.
Isn't that crazy?
In the old days, they had like politicians who would go in and they would beef up their curriculum vitae. They would beef up their resume, and occasionally, I know this is hard to believe, lie about it. And
Oh
so
no.
I know, stunning, isn't it? So they would go back. They eventually, I think the Wikipedia said, if this is your entry, you can't do anything with it. Because in the old days, I went back and corrected a few things. I will say I corrected them correctly, and I didn't lie about it. But and one thing got corrected recently, which I was delighted by, because some years ago, Brian Hitch, the artist Brian Hitch out of England, put out a book, and he mentioned me in it in one passage about inking, and mentioned that I'd work with a brush and I work with a pen most of which I do, and I work with what's called a crow quill over here. It's a Hunt 102 crow quill, and there was a typo in the book, I guess, and it came out in the book as a pro quill, PRO, which sounds really cool, but it's not the name of the pen, pen point. And I tried to correct it in Wikipedia, but A, I wasn't allowed to, and B, after all, the source, it's footnoted. In the source, it is pro quill, even though that's wrong. So I just finally said, well, people say it's a pro quill, nothing I can do about it. And I noticed here, I don't know, a couple of months ago, maybe, I was thumbing through it, and my entry, I'm always curious to see what it gets added. And it had been corrected. I think it says crow quill now, which is, I'm delighted by. So much for that. Are we done now? That's my entire story. Are we through?
There's only one other comics creator I know of that, I could be wrong, but there's only one other comics creator I know of that has an asteroid named after him, and that's Carl Barks.
Oh, well, anytime you can mention my name in the same breath as Carl Barks, I am honored beyond words. So that would be, I will say, I'm surprised that if anybody's out there who can name asteroids and you're watching this, there ought to be at least one asteroid named for Jack Kirby. I have to say, there should be a Jack Kirby asteroid out there, but I'm enormously flattered. I was very flattered anyway. I thought that was just, it was very cool. I get to lord it over my friends now, so what the heck.
Karl Barks was a big influence on you, though.
He was.
Wasn't
I was when I was a kid. I was a kid in the 50s, and my parents. I had one younger brother. We were allowed to read comics. So some comics we bought with our own money, or 25-cent allowance or whatever we were getting back then. I would have bought 2.5 comics in 1955, and but my folks wanted to encourage the habit of reading, and so they didn't care much what we read as long as we read, and comics was a good gateway for that kind of thing. So we read a lot of comics, and I read everything. There were TV like Cheyenne and Sugarfoot and Sea Hunt, all comics based on TV shows. Back then, there were comics like Helen of Troy, which was a Robert Weiss movie that came out in the mid-50s, drawn by John Buscema, beautifully drawn by John Buscema, I have to say. There were other, Alex Toth comics, Zorro, the Disney Zorro. There were half dozen or a dozen issues of that by Alex. There were some earlier Zorros, other artists drew. Alberto Gialetti drew one of them. My first introduction to Gialetti, comic I loved. And ultimately, I discovered he was drawing Turok, Son of Stone, some years later. So I began reading that. But mostly, I love funny animal comics. I read Little Lulu, not a funny animal comic, but John Standard's Little Lulu, Little Iodine, a bunch of Beetle Bailey. Again, anything we could find, classics illustrated. And the Bark stuff was some of my very favorite. And eventually, and I don't know how this came about, but then our folks knew that we loved those comics, especially the Donald Duck story in the beginning and the Mickey Mouse story in the back, which might have been by Floyd Gottfredson, although I should probably look that up and make sure I'm not screwing that one up. You can look it up and then change it and dub my voice when I say the guy's name. If I've got it wrong, you can just have somebody else's, stuck it in. But
I'll put my own voice over it.
There you go. That'll be foul. Nobody will know.
Nobody will know.
So, and I'll just say, hey, the bag of Mickey Mouse stories written by Floyd Gottfredson. So that way I won't have to worry about the lips either. But the Bark stuff, it was just a wonderfully written. Frequently, Donald would take jobs all over the world in different places. Barks, I didn't know at the time, Barks was very careful when he drew different locations, like the desert. What's the desert in Australia? The big one. The Nullarbor Plain, some of these places, he tried to draw them. He drew them the way they looked. Somewhere along the way, I learned or I heard he had a large National Geographic collection. So he researched that stuff. It wasn't just cartoony animals doing funny stuff. It was stuff against, in a sense, a real background. And I wouldn't have known that at the time, but it made the work more persuasive without my really understanding how he was achieving it. So we loved those comics. And then, of course, he invented Uncle Scrooge. A little before I was reading it, but by the time I was reading them, Uncle Scrooge was coming out maybe as a quarterly book, and that was a full comic. And so Barks he would do big adventures with Uncle Scrooge, where Uncle Scrooge would look for the lost cities of Cibola, or he would hunt the Incas, the Inca Emperor's lost gold mines, it was all to do with money most of the time. But he was hunting all over the world for stuff, or fighting the Beagle Boys who were trying to steal his money bin and take the bucks. And so the Walt Disney comics and stories, my parents bought us a subscription. So we had a subscription to those comics for several years. I don't remember for how long. I can tell which ones they are because, of course, back then, when you got a subscription, comics were folded in half, and they had a brown paper wrapper around the outside. The tops and bottom were open. So all those comics that I still have, many of them I still have a little white crease right down the center of the cover where they were folded over. But, I got them to read. I didn't get them to, at the time, it didn't make any difference. I stuck comics in my back pocket. I read comics till they fell apart. And so I really, I did not treat comics with reverence. I treated them as an exciting adventure that took me out of myself and out of the world I was in to some other place. And that's why they were there.
Karl Barks. So a couple of things. I was binging your Thor run back in 2011, and I was also rediscovering Karl Barks because Fantagraphics was putting out
Oh, that's right. Yes.
The complete collection, and I get to Frog Thor, and that's like the second time I'm reading it. But the first time I'm reading it, I'm not connecting it to anything. I get to Frog Thor, and you put it at the very end. It's like for Catapult, Karl Barks, and all the citizens of Duckburg, and I just went, Walt Simonson is a Karl Barks fan. That's so awesome.
Well, he had when I do comics, like a write and draw comics, I will occasionally, as I'm working, I'll have an idea. I'll say, oh, this would be kind of a cool story. And sometimes it's no more than a sentence. Sometimes I'll start writing and a whole plot will develop. And so usually by the time I'm finished a book like Thor or the Fantastic Four, or right now Ragnarok for IDW, by the time I'm done, and I'm not done Ragnarok yet, by the time I'm done, I have more ideas in my idea file than I have issues I put out. I just can't get them all. I can't get them all in. But I had an idea for when I was doing Thor for Marvel, where the note just says, tip of the hat to Karl Barks. And that's really all. I just thought it'd be kind of fun to do something, to tip my hat to Karl Barks. I eventually, and I don't remember how this happened now, I reached a point where I thought, oh, I could do something right here. And I had the idea of turning Thor into an animal. And that would give me a shot at least a Karl Barks salute without trying to be Karl Barks, which nobody can be. And my original thought was to do a story in which Thor was turned into a duck. And that's because, in fairy tales, English fairy tales, frequently, or out of Northern Europe, when the handsome prince is enchanted, he's often a duck. Or actually, I'm sorry, he's often a frog. I thought of a duck originally because of Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge and Carl. And so I thought about a duck, but at the time when I did it, I thought, oh well, there's already Daffy Duck, there's Donald Duck, there's Howard the Duck at Marvel. There were several ducks around. And then I had the idea for a frog because that's what princes get turned into. And Barks did a story in the Walt Disney Comics and stories, a Donald Duck story, where Donald and the nephews were visited by the greatest hero Duckburg ever had, and it was a frog, and they named the frog Catapult, and so that's where that came from. And I didn't call him Catapult in the comic; that was too close.
Yeah.
I didn't want to sail that close to the wind, but it worked out perfectly to be able to do a frog hero. Thor is a frog, borrow from fairy tale antecedents, borrow from Karl Barks, and try and do a story that was really a salute to that stuff. And one of the things that's in that story, or that framed it, is something I learned from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby when I was a big Marvel reader in the 60s. I was in college and I was reading every Marvel comic that came out, which back then was only about 11 titles a month, and they were cheap, so I could buy them all and I could read everything. That would not be true now.
It was Kirby and Ditko.
It would cost me a lot more money now. Yes, Kirby, Ditko, some nice Don Heck Avengers, John Buscema. They had some, Gene Colan's Iron Man I loved.
Yeah.
There was a bunch of stuff I loved back then. And so, but one of the things that I learned from Stan and Jack, and probably from Roy to a certain extent, but the early stuff I read with Stan and Jack's work, is that if you keep a straight face, you can get away with almost anything in a story. And I didn't want to write a story. I don't like stories where it's like, wow, isn't this the author? You can hear the author saying to you as you read it, hey, wow, isn't this dumb? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Isn't this like really stupid? And because it's really implying we're all so superior to this material. And yet, of course, you're still reading it and you're still writing it. You're still collecting your goddamn check. And so Stan and Jack did some of the most outrageous stories. No frogs, I don't think, but in general, outrageous stories. And they just kept a straight face through the whole thing. And that just made it fantastic. It was, you could buy into the universe, and you weren't being condescended to. You weren't condescending to the material. You were just reading a good story. And so in that frog story, I mean, yes, it's a tip of the hat to Carl. It's a tip of the hat to Stan and Jack. In some ways, it's a parody of high fantasy. It's a parody of my own work. And it could be a satire. I could never keep those straight. But it's basically, it's the hero rides in from out of town. The princess is in trouble. He gets to the castle. The armies are surrounding it, bad guys, and he leads the charge out of the castle and saves the princess, or however you want to frame it. And so it was a parody of my own stuff and of high fantasy in general. And but it's still done very straight. And I got to include the crocodiles in the New York sewers, which is an urban legend that I've never seen one, but that's one of the stories. People get these pet crocodiles and they dump them down the toilet when they get too big to live or to live in their apartments. And so the sewers are crawling with all these pet alligators and crocodiles that are now bigger than. So I got to use that part in the story. And we used to, when I was doing that, what was that, 85 or so, we were living in just off Central Park on the west side, on West 71st Street.
Yeah.
So the reservoir that's in that story is just north of where we lived. At the time, it was a lot of people used to run around it. I mean, I never did. I was not a runner. But, it was all local geography. And also, you would see signs stuck over in the corner of the park on a stick. There'd be a stick with a sign on it. And the sign would say, essentially, don't let your pet in here. There's rat poison around. So they really left rat poison. It's New York, there's rat problems. So a lot of that story is, not unlike Barks's backgrounds, is based on stuff that was really going on in New York. It didn't quite work that way in real life, the way it worked in that story. But it was inspired by a lot of stuff that was true at the time we were living in New York. I'm sure they're still putting rat poison now. They have not solved the rat problem in New York, so I'm sure they're still there. But that's really all that stuff came together to make that story. And at the time I did it, that's, mostly letters I get is the old days, all snail mail, very little internet happening then. There was some internet, but not a lot. And most of the letters you got on a comic were positive, even on awful comics. They were just, wow, this is great. And on that one storyline, I didn't get a lot of negative mail. I didn't generally get a lot of negative mail, but on that one, I got about half good and half people writing and saying,
what is this?
Yeah, what is this? Is this supposed to be funny? I'm not quite sure. Well, it was a riot. And now, if someone at a convention, for example, comes up and wants book signed or mentions a story that I did, there are about 3 or 4 stories that get mentioned more than any others.
Can I guess what they are?
Sure.
Is it
you want to guess?
Frog Thor, Beta Ray Bill?
Yep.
Surtur, Ragnarok and Roll?
Surtur in general, but that's like a long saga. So I'm thinking of the little chapters, the 2 or 3 episodes.
It's
I was doing those guys.
Yeah, it's the one where Loki goes for myself after Thor goes.
Well, that panel gets mentioned more than say the issue. But yes, that panel is a lot of people's favorite panel. But there are 2 other stories that people will, if they're mentioning stories, that they will mention to me more than others.
Is it He Stood Alone at Gallerbrew?
Yes, that's one of them. The other you might or might not guess. You have to be pretty familiar with the material, I think. But I believe it was Kurt Busiek's favorite story of the ones I did in the book.
Is it? Oh man. The last one's always the hardest to name because there's
I know.
Because there's so many possible
I'll tell you what it was.
So, is it the one issue? The one splash page issue?
No. I mean, that's one of my favorites is the grandfather issue, the great grandfather issue that Sal Buscema drew. I love that one. I love the writing. I love the story. No, it's The Last Viking. Where he discovers the Viking in Antarctica and then takes him off, and they kill the dragon Fafnir, and the Viking dies, and the Valkyries and Odin show up in the sky to all the thunder, and nobody sees it, but Thor sees it. But they just get the lightning and the thunder, and the body disappears and goes up in the flames, and the Valkyries ride Elif the Lost into Valhalla as perhaps the last Viking hero. And that's one that people.
That's
mention.
An amazing issue. You get to the splash page with Odin picking him up, and
that was
cool. I just thought it was an amazing issue. I'm sad I didn't get that.
It's okay. There were a lot of issues.
Well, one of the things that I thought was fascinating, something that you do share with Barks and Stan and Jack, is you did mention it. If you keep a straight face, you can get away with anything. That was the 80s. There was a whole movement to make things more realistic, gritty, and grim. But I always just felt to me like you were having fun. I mean, you've got, I mean, when people say things like Thor isn't funny, especially in the wake of the movies, like they'll be like, Thor isn't funny. I'll go back to Stan and Jack and I'll think one classic issue is him literally fighting Hercules for 20 pages because Hercules was hitting on Jane. I don't know how you
Yep.
do that in live action. And you're naming your big epic Ragnarok and roll. You,
Yes.
you got
That
Thor.
was thanks to Howard Chaykin, by the way. I would give Howard credit for coming up with that.
Did he also name Ragnarok and roll 2?
I think that was probably me. But it was, I mean, the model for my run on Thor was really the work that Stan and Jack did in the character. Um, I started reading Thor. First Marvel comic I ever bought was Journey in the Mystery 120, which turns out to be the beginning of a 4-part story with Loki and the Absorbing Man trying to take over Asgard. Of course, it's Loki, and I don't believe Stan and Jack did any other 4-part stories. It's the only one. Um, and the first 2 issues of that were on the newsstand at the same time, which is unusual. Mostly when the new issue comes in, they take any unsold old copies, take them off, tear off the cover, send them back, get credit for it. And they're not usually on the stands at the same time. But as it happened, 120 and 121 were there at the same time. I was able to read them both standing in front of the comics rack. And it was actually a drugstore rather than a newsstand. And because it was a drugstore, nobody came by and said, "Hey, kid, this isn't the library," and chased me out. I just got to read it. And I had seen a Thor comic about a year earlier. I was a freshman in college. I was visiting dorm room with one of my friends, and he had a Thor comic. I think it was 113, where Thor fights the Grey Gargoyle. The Grey Gargoyle comes back for the second time, and Dan Goldman was his name, my roommate, not roommate, but my friend. And I was visiting his room. They had the comic lying around. I picked it up. I was already a mythology fan. I'd read a lot of mythology as a kid. My parents had a couple of books about it, including Norse mythology, which was my favorite. Um, and so the idea that there was a comic book about Thor was just, wow, this is great. And so I read it. Neat story. You got a lot of the stuff, the 30-second rule for the hammer, or 60-second, whatever it was, stuff like that. That was all in there already. And it was all in that one issue, the one issue story with the Tales of Asgard. So the lead story was probably 16 pages long. It wasn't gigantic. Inked by Chickstone, and it was great. And but I didn't see any more of them. It turned out that where my parents lived, Marvels were only distributed. They had lousy distribution back then. They were only in one chain of drugstores in this area I live in, suburban Washington D.C. And they were a little far away to get to any of them. And eventually, I think it was with my mom, maybe in the drug fair they were called. And there was one out in it's probably Greenbelt. I'm not sure what that area would be called now, off Greenbelt Road, which is about 5 miles north of my house. And we were there. That's where I found these 2 issues of Thor. But, I was a freshman in college. It was the summer, I guess, maybe between freshman and sophomore year. And, the idea that an 18-year-old guy would buy a comic book was sort of an alien idea at the time. I just thought, well, I really loved them. I didn't buy them. And then, but I loved them. And so I must have hopped on my bike and ridden back to that goddamn drugstore at least 4 times just to read those comics again. So like a 10-mile round trip. I was thinner in those days and more fit. And it was it was not a hard drive. You didn't have to drive on or ride your bike on main roads. There were side roads you could take. And ultimately, I think about the 5th time I was there, I just said, "Oh, God damn it." And I just bought the comics. Okay. Screw it. I don't want to drive. I don't have to ride back there again. And
Who am I fooling? Who am I fooling?
Yeah, really. And how long would they, no one was spying on me and say, "Oh, he's buying comics." Ooh. And it was really just, I bought them, took them home. And then I went back to school. Yeah, it would have been the summer between freshman and sophomore year. Because I went back to school in the fall, September, and couldn't find any more. I couldn't find any more Marvel comics. I was in a little town in New England, There was a tobacco store, as they were back then. And the tobacco store had, all the smokes you want, cigars, everything like that. But they had it was a long, narrow store, had a long wall that was all paperbacks. And then they had freestanding, greeting cards and, like a stationery. So it was a mixture of all sorts of stuff. There was a news rack up front with all kinds of magazines. They got weird stuff. They got copies of His Name is Savage by Gil Kane, the actual magazine Gil put out a year or two later, which nobody had. I mean, I discovered later that was a comic that, I don't know how it got distributed there, but I picked up a copy. I knew Gil stuff by then. And they had a spinner rack, and the spinner rack was like a big triangle. So there were about, I don't even remember, 2 or 3 or 4 racks of comics on each side. A lot of comics, but no marbles. And ultimately, so I've told this story before many times, but what happened was I didn't find it, and at the end of the second issue, the Absorbing Man clocks Thor.
Mm-hmm.
Thor stops to save a small kid who's run out in the middle of the battlefield, and he moves him, and of course his back is to the Absorbing Man. So the Absorbing Man clocks him with his ball and chain, and Thor's lying there on the ground, and the Absorbing Man, I beat Thor. Only someone as powerful as Thor could beat him. And I'd only read it. I mean, I'd read superhero comics in the 60s and 50s, well, 50s, but they were Superman and stuff like that. They were not like these comics. So I hadn't read comics like this. And I thought, oh my God, they've killed Thor. And and so I really wanted to find that next issue. I was like obsessed. And weeks went by, and fine enough weeks had gone by. I knew I had missed it. I knew it had already come out. So I wrote Marvel Comics a letter. I do not have a copy of that letter. I'm very grateful. It would only embarrass me now, I'm sure. But I asked essentially, and this is no comic shops. There were, I discovered later, you could buy old used issues from guys who had comic shops in their mother's basements, that kind of thing, their parents' basement.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that at the time. There weren't comic shops. And back issues, a comic came out this month. It was gone next month. You didn't see it again, for the most part. You didn't, and the idea that they'd eventually reprint it in like all those books that are behind you, it was just completely alien and never occurred to anybody. So I wrote Marvel and I asked if I could buy a copy of Journey to the Mystery 122. And I pled my case. That's why I'm glad I don't have the letter, because I'm sure I explained why I was berserk to get a copy, because I couldn't believe what had happened. And then one day I was in Augie's tobacco shop. I used to kind of drift in, look around. And I found 123, which was the 4th issue of the 4-part series. I missed the 3rd one. And the funny thing, I read it, so I got the end of the story. And the funny part was, I couldn't tell what I'd missed. What was in that last issue? It all seems to kind of, I don't have to have it. But it was still. And then one day, a really nice brand spanking new manila envelope showed up in my mailbox at college with my name on it and a return address from Marvel Comics in New York City.
Oh, wow.
And I opened it up, and it was a pristine copy of Journey to the Mystery 122. And there was a little note in it, pre-printed, which said, "Dear blank, thanks for letting us hear from you. Stan and the gang," or something like that, all printed. But somebody had written in, "Dear Walt." At the bottom it said, "Couldn't let you down. Hope you enjoyed the issue." And I went bananas. Read the comic. It didn't tell me a lot I didn't really kind of guess already, but nevertheless. I mean, the funny part was the splash page. I was so worried about Thor being killed. The splash page is the Absorbed Man. He's still going, ha, ha, ha. And right behind him, Thor's getting up off the ground like this with his hammer. And says, "Doesn't he suspect I was merely stunned?" And I go, "I didn't suspect. I didn't know that." So, but from that, I was a diehard Marvel fan from that moment on. That just blew me away. And I kept the comic. I kept the note. I stapled them together, so that was a no-no. But I didn't want to lose the note, so I stapled the back cover. And I took it into the office one day, many years later, when I was working, probably in the 80s, and I showed it to Flo Steinberg, who had been the girl Friday for Marvel back in the very early days, and then come back to work for them as a proofreader for a while in the 80s. And, "Oh yes, that's my handwriting." And so I knew. So I know I owe a lot to Carl Barks. I owe a lot to Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and a bunch of other guys. but I owe a great deal to Flo Steinberg, for the late Flo Steinberg, I'm afraid, for taking the time out to listen to a young man's pleading cry for help and sending me the comic, and so for a number of years, well, we used to get snail mail, don't so much anymore. I would send comics out to kids that, not necessarily, I mean, it had to be a letter I liked or it appealed to me or whatever, but I did send a bunch of comics out over the years in the Thor issues of Thor and Fantastic Four. I haven't done that in a long time now. If you're out there watching, don't send me any letters and ask for my back issues. I'm not.
He's out. He's out of stock, guys.
Yeah, I'm out of stock. That's right. And besides, you can find almost all of them on the web digitally now, so you're not going to miss
Seriously.
anything. But it was still, it was such a generous gesture, and it was so Flo. It was so much what Flo was like that I was very moved. And of course, within a couple of months, I was buying every Marvel comic book that say they made back their postage on that one comic for sure.
Honestly, like the thing that I've learned meeting creators, doing these interviews and everything is like when you have a positive experience with a creator, it just makes you want to read their stuff more. So
yeah.
But also I think that story kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff that made Silver Age Marvel so different, because you were mentioning, because I've had Danny Fingeroth on the show quite a bit, and he always talks about Stan and the Marvel bullpen and the different things that they were doing, making sure that everyone felt like a community. But you were also mentioning Kirby, and I was watching this documentary on YouTube called Jack Kirby Storyteller, where everyone, Barry Windsor-Smith, Marv Wolfman, everyone was saying that at first they didn't get Kirby. Whereas you said, I'm smarter than the rest of those guys because I got him right away.
Yeah, they edited that so it sounds like I'm talking right to those guys. And when I made that remark, I was not talking to those guys. But I was smarter than they were. I'm talking to them now. The first issue I read, the one in Dan's room, it began with a splash page that had a Viking ship, a Jack Kirby Viking ship. So it wasn't exactly a Viking, but a Jack Kirby Viking with a big dragon head or monster head that Jack would draw. And all the Asgardians standing, some of them were standing outside the deck on the side of the ship. There were like little steps out there. There were Thor's on there and Odin's on there. And they're all sailing off to fight. I forgot what it was. I should look it up. It was funny. The mini giants or the something, it was some oddball kind of quasi-Norse, but not really name for these guys. And it said, there was a little caption that essentially said, we promised old Jack Kirby, O-L apostrophe. We promised old Jack Kirby that we'd let him, do a fight scene to begin with and whatever he wanted to do. So here it is. And then they have this, and then the next page is they're fighting all this stuff, and Thor and Odin are fighting back to back or whatever they're doing, fighting. And then after the next half page, they're wrapping it up, and they've beaten their enemies, and I'm proud of you, my son, and stuff like. And then the story begins. So out of a 16-page story, the first 2.5 pages are just this fight that have nothing to do with anything else in the comic. And what's even funnier about that is when I read it, as I said, it was the first Marvel comic I read. It had a credit line, but I didn't really look at that or didn't register. So when I read, we promised old Jack Kirby that we'd let him do this stuff. We would open the fight sequence or whatever. I didn't recognize Jack's name, and I didn't see it in the credits. And my initial thought, and for years I just thought, man, some fan wrote in and said, I'd love to see a giant fight scene, and that's what we're going to do for this guy. So that fan Jack Kirby got to have a whole opening sequence because he wrote him a note, and then one day I'd gone back, I was rereading it, and I only said, we promised Jack Kirby, smack my head. Oh no, of course. But I hadn't looked at it in years, and I'd forgotten that's what it said. So, but it was very free and easy. There was a joy about that stuff in a lot of ways, and drama, soap opera, all that stuff jammed together. And whether it's because they were dealing with real human problems, unlike DC. DC, I remember covers, and I liked those as a kid. Don't get me wrong. I had the original Superman comic where Supergirl shows up.
Oh, really?
Supergirl shows up in the beginning, and there's a story in the back. Metallo is in the back end. My mom threw that one away, so I don't have it now.
Oh man.
That's what happens. But there'd be comics like if Superman doesn't eat these 5,000 hamburgers by noon, Earth will die. Now as an adult, I think that's hysterical.
Yeah.
But in college, I'm kind of going, really? Really? This is where you're taking this character? And so I didn't really, I kind of, as people did at the time, kind of graduated from DC. Well, many people, not everybody, but graduated from DC Comics into Marvel Comics. And there was a time, I mean, when I was reading them, right, the height of when I was reading them, 66, 67, they had gotten the rep as being a kind of a college guy's comic books. Esquire magazine, which was a pretty fancy mag back in the day, a men's mag without the nudity, but short stories and all sorts of fashion articles, for all the stuff. I was never going to be that guy. But they had an article on Marvel Comics and how Marvel Comics had, were taking college campuses by storm. And they had a big, might have been even a double-page spread, I think probably by Kirby, because there are a couple of characters like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange that Jack really didn't draw much and drew very differently from the way Ditko drew them. So it was a very strange-looking Doctor Strange, to me anyway, even if it was Jack. But it was an article about, colleges and Marvel Comics. So they were hip, whatever that means, at the time. And certainly I read them. I knew a couple of guys on campus who read them. I made a friend, my senior year or not. I know the dorm I was living in, but I was in the dorm 2 years, my junior and senior year. I think this guy was a year ahead of me, so maybe junior year. He had a bunch of Marvel comics, and we had what were called social dorms then, long gone now. But they had a big room, like a big living room for everybody. They were 4-man suites or 6-man suites. It was a boys' college at the time, men's college, and so they had a big room, and then a corridor would go off it, maybe down some stairs or up some stairs, and then there'd be 4 bedrooms off that, and then a common bathroom at the far end of the hall. So I went over, and it turned out, and I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, wherever you are, he had about a year's worth of Marvel comics I had never read. They started a year before I had found them and went up. They're pretty complete. There are a lot of them. They're missing a few issues here and there, but a lot of them. And so I sat in their living room. I know his roommates from Beans, but I sat there, and finally they all gone to bed, and I just sat there bombing through every Marvel comic that this guy had. I finished up just as dawn was breaking and went back to my dorm room, and I went out, let myself out very quietly, and went back across the darkened quad with the dawn light just starting to come up. Got back to my room and went to bed for a couple of hours before class. But that's how I read some of the Grey Gargoyle, not Grey Gargoyle, who was the Dragon Man? That was the first time I read Dragon Man. That was one of those issues. So so I was really into it. There were other kids there, a few, not a lot, but nobody, I didn't have nobody made fun of me for reading comics. I did a ton of drawing at the time. Ultimately, probably junior year, I did a whole bunch of drawings. I have one left. I don't know where the rest of them went. They were on what was then typewriter paper, copier paper, written up by 11. And I drew a ton of Marvel characters, one character, like pinups, one character per sheet. And I colored them with colored pencils in their appropriate colors. And I did the logo behind them, where I would, if it was a character that had his own logo, I did that logo, copied it, did it, colored it. There were no backgrounds. They were just vignetted against white. And I must have done a couple of dozen of them, maybe more than that. I read Red Skull with his fist out, kind of like that. And initially, a lot of them were done. I didn't try to draw the figures entirely like the guys that were drawing the comics, but I did somewhat. I tried to draw, I hadn't seen like a lot of artists rotate through the comics. Thor was always Jack Kirby. And so when I drew Thor, I tried to draw Thor looking like a Jack Kirby character inked by Vinnie Coletta, because Vinnie was the standard inker for a long time in that book. As it happened, the issues of the Hulk that I found to begin with were drawn by Bill Everett, of all people, and they were very strange Hulks. And so that's the Hulk that I drew. I drew a Bill Everett Hulk with these kind of abs that looked like they were ditches across his belly. And when I drew Iron Man, I drew Ultimo. It was an Iron Man foe, drawn in my best, Gene Colan imitating style. I learned a lot from that, actually, but I have one drawing left. Oh, if you're curious, anybody out there, I am on Facebook. I'm old, so I'm on Facebook. All you young hip people aren't on that. I understand that. That's okay.
Young people are on TikTok.
That's right. I'm not doing that. So I'm already on 3 social media platforms. 3 is plenty. So I'm done. I'm done doing that stuff. But and even so, Facebook I understand. Twitter I kind of understand. Instagram I have no clue about. I just
Oh,
post
no.
my drawings. I post my drawings on Instagram. That's what I do mostly on my pages. Is if you go on Facebook, I know if you're young, a bitter pill to swallow, but there's a page called the official Walter Simonson page.
Yeah.
I have one that's just me. That's a personal page where I friend people I actually know, as opposed to fans and comic shops and stuff. But they're kind of mirrored pages. And I have a bunch of galleries on that. I have hundreds of drawings going back to about 3rd grade. My parents saved everything, and so
There's also the Walt Simonson Appreciation Society.
There is. I didn't start that page. I participate. That's right. One of my fans, Oliver Selby in England, put that page up before I was on Facebook. So I know that one has more limited galleries. Other people post a lot of gallery stuff, but on the official page, one of the galleries is, I think it's just called Old Stuff, and that goes back to a tile of a locomotive I painted and had fired in 3rd grade. And then other more recent drawings up to about 1977. I was already a professional by then. I'm not sure why I went that far, but I did. And one of the drawings I have there from my time in college is the only drawing I have left from that series of character drawings I did, which is the Destroyer from Thor. And there was no logo for him, so I just invented my own logo and put the Destroyer behind him. And probably copied it. At that point, probably copying a Jack Kirby figure more than just trying to kind of draw one. I don't remember, but I have that one drawing in all its glory in colored pencil. It's on the page.
I'm on record saying this in other places, but I always say that no one reminds me more of Jack Kirby without actually looking like Jack Kirby than your work. Because it's all the foreshortening and all of there's a lot of power when you do action scenes and everything. It just comes right at you. Nobody else really does that the same with that kind of same energy, but looks different.
I have to say it's what I took from Jack. I don't try to draw like Jack, although there's a great deal of Jack underneath my drawing. I mean, frequent characters are throwing punches. Their feet are like 8 feet apart when they're trying to really throw punches and stuff. I got a lot of that from Jack. But one of the things about Jack's stuff that I loved was that it was so alive. It was so full of power and energy. There are a lot of other things he did very well that people tend to overlook, but that's one of the things that I did love. And so I tried pretty hard, especially in the early days, to incorporate that. It's not everything I did. I did a strip called Manhunter many years ago.
Yeah.
And Manhunter is less informed by Jack's work. It's not quite a superhero book in the ordinary sense. And so I did Thor, the Fantastic Four, even doing Ragnarok now. I keep Jack in mind. I don't have to go look at his comics anymore. I mean, there are several artists I'm influenced by. Jack's a major one. But I looked at his stuff so much when I was younger, and I just imbibed so much of it. I internalized so much of it. If I never saw a Jack Kirby comic again, I would still do what I'm doing, and I would have the Jack influence. There are other artists like Jim Holdaway, who was a British artist, died at the age of 45, I think, or thereabouts. Much too young. I'm still angry about it. He did a newspaper strip in the 60s written by Peter O'Donnell, created by Peter O'Donnell, called Modesty Blaise.
Yeah.
And Jim was the original artist. He died in 1970. He literally died right as I discovered the strip. I discovered some reprints of the strip, and he died right in there somewhere in 69 or 70. And so he did about 14 or 15, 16 episodes. And I've looked at those episodes a million times. And but they're black and white. They're for a newspaper strip, and they're very graphic. Their storytelling is really beautiful. And every so often, I get stuck somewhere for an idea or a storytelling bit or whatever it might be, I'll pull out a Modesty Blaise, one of Jim's Modesty Blaises. I'll just read through it again.
That's
and
awesome.
I'm completely refreshed by what, this guy, I wish I had met him. I wish he'd lived 40 more years and done a million more drawings. But I feel so lucky to have the work he did do. And even as limited as, 15, 16 episodes, there's a lot of different stuff in there. And that was a big influence in Manhunter. When I was doing Manhunter, there's one there's one chapter of Manhunter where they show different geographical locations he visits, and one of them is, I don't know, the Himalayas or something like that. I just swiped Holdaway's Himalayan look. There's one story that takes place in the Himalayas in Tibet in one of Holdaway's middle stories, and called The Black Pearl. And there were little stone huts and whatever else I could find. And that's, at the time, reference was hard to come by. It was hard to find, Tibetan stone huts at the time I was doing these. So didn't have the internet to work with to find all the reference. So I took some from his stuff, but just the way he had his line work and his drawing, his storytelling, just a major influence. Frank Bellamy is another one, did a strip called Garth, which was toward the end of his life. He died while he was doing that. But it had the stories weren't as interesting. I don't know who wrote the stuff. It wasn't bad. It was a strip that went forever. And Peter O'Donnell, who invented Modesty Blaise, had written a bunch of earlier Garths before he began Modesty Blaise, although not with Bellamy as an artist, I don't think. But he had these massive figures, and again, very graphic. People would have, I still draw it. People can't really get it here, but they'll have their arm come out, and then the hand is broken, like it sort of goes down at the wrist, and then the fingers come straight out. And when you see that, that's me doing Bellamy. That's where that comes from. So Bellamy stuff I like. Big Moebius fan. I just put a drawing
Sergio
up.
Toppi.
Love Sergio Toppi. I just put a Moebius a drawing up I did for Ragnarok back in the beginning of a few years ago, and somebody said, I've loved your stuff for 35 years. Man, I never realized how influenced you were by Moebius, because there's some stuff in this that he thought was very Moebius-like. Huge Sergio.
I saw
Toppi
that
fan.
comment.
Yeah. Huge Sergio Toppi fan, and very influential in the stuff I'm doing. I'm kind of moving a little away from some of that right now. Well, especially at the moment, I've just done 2 issues of X Factor, a book called X-Men Legends, and I did issues 3 and 4. Wheezy wrote it. It's X Factor in these 2 issues, 2-part story, and it was designed when Wheezy got the assignment. It's designed to fit into the continuity of her old run from 30 years ago, and I drew it for a couple of years.
You were involved with.
I drew it for a while, and after I got off, there were 2 issues by Art Adams, and then I think after that, Paul Smith took it over. And so the stories that Wheezy wrote, these 2 issues, they fit in between the Art Adams and the Paul Smith stories. So it's about two months after I got off the book. But I've tried to draw those as much as I can 30 years later, to not be too far out from the work I was doing 30 years ago. So, because I think they're going to reprint these X Factors, at least some of them, with the new issues, kind of sandwiched in. Well, I don't know if I'm going to print Arthur's or just start after that and use my 2 as the introduction. But I wanted it to look like it fit in that work from 30 years ago, without being too far out. I suppose if I really doing it, I would have drawn it like Arthur if I could have. I can't, so I'm not doing that.
How does doing something like that feel, though? Because you're not the artist you were 30 years ago.
Well, it was. I kept it simpler. I looked at a lot of the old stuff. I didn't copy any of it, but I did try to draw it in some ways. Well, simpler layouts, except when you're doing a team book, your layouts aren't going to be very simple. You've got all these characters you got to cram in panel after panel. So you kind of compose them and try and fit them all together. But I just looked at a lot of it and tried to kind of imbibe some of that again, and then get it back out there to paper. Whether I was successful or not, I have no idea. I did see one comment that I took as a compliment. I mean, it wasn't meant as a compliment or anything. It was just a question. It wasn't really meant as a compliment. It wasn't meant as a slam. It was just the way it was. It was on Twitter, I think. And somebody wondered why Marvel had recolored, or why they changed the color in this issue of X, because this came out, the first of the 2 issues came out like 2 days ago.
I love it.
And they wanted to know why they changed. And somebody said, well, this is like a new issue. This isn't like one of the old ones. And so I took that to mean whoever had seen it hadn't really looked at it and gone, oh, this is a modern Simonson. They'd looked at it and thought it was an issue from 30 years ago that, Marvel kind of gussied up in different kinds of coloring. And so I mean, I took that as a compliment, whether it was meant to or not. I mean, that's why I took that I was at least somewhat successful in getting the work to fit relatively seamlessly into the old stuff. But of course, everyone has to make their own mind about that, about how that worked.
That's not the first time you've done that though, because in '99 you did a continuation, a conclusion of your Manhunter.
I did.
Saga.
Archie Goodwin was the writer and the creator of the strip, and he died in '98, I think. Had cancer for like 10 years, or 8 or 10 years. So his day, he fought it, and he would get sick, he would get better, he'd get sick, he'd get better. And so when he died, it was a shock, but it wasn't really a surprise. And what had happened was that he'd gone back to work for DC some years earlier, and DC had wanted to reprint Manhunter, but they wanted a new story to put in the reprint so that there'd be something in there that people hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
And Archie and I talked about it from time to time, but, without your young, well, no, I wasn't that young then. That's only 10, 15 years ago. But you do it without a sense of the clock running. Most that's how it is.
Yeah.
Really late in life, maybe not so much. You're more aware of the clock. But, I'd go in, we'd talk about it. And neither one of us, we liked the original work. Both of us were very happy and I think proud of the original run of that book. And my feeling is, if nobody's ever gone back and redone that character exactly as we did it, they've done some clones. Kurt Busiek used a clone. He asked me if it was okay. I said, fine. I don't know the character. I'm happy to have whatever they want to do. But no one's gone back and resurrected that guy. And in a way, I take that as a compliment to the work that Archie and I did, that it's very complete. It's a complete story in and of itself. And we felt that, well, if somebody else goes back and does Manhunter, it's not going to screw it up. Not that stuff. If we go back and do a story, we could screw it up because he's our guy.
Because it's canon.
If somebody else does it, we don't care.
Yeah.
Even if DC claims it's canon. So we couldn't think of it, and we didn't want to do one of these stories where on chapter 3, page 5, between panels 7 and 8, this is what really happened. And then you get a sandwich in something, and it's, we don't want to do that either. And so one day I'm in the office, and Archie calls me into his office and says, I have an idea for Manhunter. So he laid it out for me, and I thought it was really cool. I thought, wow, we could make that work. That could work. So we spent about an hour or two shooting the breeze, working out the plot, which is in the beginning of the original run, Archie wrote it full script. And by the end of the run, we were working what was called Marvel style, where he would give me a plot, I would thumbnail it out, he would write from my layouts, and then I would get lettered and I'd finish it. So we did that for a couple hours, got a plot nailed down, we're both happy with, and we both felt wouldn't damage the original 7 chapters. And I went home to draw it. It was going to be an 8-page story, like the 8-page chapters of most of that run. I did some cover sketches that I wasn't happy with, although I look at them now, they seem perfectly fine. I don't know what the hell my problem was. But, you're trying to get something I hadn't drawn in, 82, 92, 25 years, something like that. And I began doing some little drawings and stuff like that, but I wasn't really on it. And about 3 or 4 months later, I got a call from Paul Levitz, who was the publisher of DC Comic, on a weekend, Saturday, I think. I'm not sure, might have been Sunday. And Paul was an old friend. I'd known Paul when he was a gopher, and he had come up through the ranks and become publisher. He was a good friend. And he called me up to tell me that Archie had died, that he'd gone to the hospital a week earlier, and he did not come out. Now, he'd gone to the hospital many times, gotten kind of pumped up on juice or whatever, and then he got better and they sent him back out. So it wasn't like any of us really expected him to go into the hospital and not make it. Mm-hmm. But again, he'd been sick for a long time. So as much of a shock as it was not a lot of big surprise. But I thought it was very kind of Paul to call me up. He knew what Archie meant to me, what a good friend he was. And it was very nice of him to call me up and let me know himself what the score was. And I went and woke Wheezy up. I was awake when Paul called us in the morning. Wheezy was still asleep, but I went and woke her up, told her it was, because she'd been a close friend of Archie and Archie's wife, Ann. And so I cursed myself for not getting the goddamn layouts done so Archie could write the script. And because really, that character for me was Archie and me. And I did not want to write the script. I'd written a lot of stuff by then, but I just thought, it just wouldn't be the same. So I just thought by not getting it done in a timely fashion, my middle name, that was going to be the end of it. And then one day it came up in conversation. I had some of the drawings in the front of my drawing board, top of my drawing board, I have a big drawing board. And Wheezy said she wondered if maybe I could do it as a silent story. Now, my wife has been an editor as well as a writer, and she is one of the best goddamn editors the business ever had.
She's one of the greatest of all time.
That's what I think. I would put Archie maybe as the greatest, but Archie, I mean, in his own way, Stan, it was a different world back then.
Yeah.
There are several guys you put in that category, and your personal preferences, whatever it is. But she's phenomenal. And she said, maybe you could do it as a silent story. I thought, oh. So I began thinking about it. I went to DC and I said, look, I don't know if I can do this because it's some complex stuff in some of the part of the story. And I said, but if I do this as a silent story, do you want to run it? And whoever I talked to, probably Paul, said, yeah, we'll run it. And I said, well, because it's silent, I don't have all these word balloons. It's going to be longer than 8 pages. I don't know how long until I get it laid out, but it's going to be longer than 8 pages. They said, that's okay. And they gave it to Denny O'Neil to edit. So Denny was the editor. And what it really meant was he kind of trafficked it through. I mean, I began thumbnailing it. And mostly I do my thumbnails again on copier paper. I'll do 1 page per piece of copy paper. And I started thumbnailing it. And I must have done the first 4 pages about 3 or 4 times. And I could just feel the pacing wasn't right. It wasn't coming out. It wasn't what it needed to be. And I think the 5th time I started it, I began getting past like page 4. And ultimately, I had it on 23 pages. I think it's 23. And I had figured out there were several weird spots where you almost needed dialogue. And in the old days, I had done my own sound effects and I drew my own sound effects, drew my own display lettering, titles and sound effects and whatever. So there's at least one place where some information gets passed on because the guy has a newspaper with a headline. So I wrote the damn headline. I didn't feel I was stepping on Archie's toes by writing the newspaper headline. And at one point, there's a sign Batman points to, and it says Gotham City Limits.
Yeah.
And that at the end of the story. And I didn't mind writing that either. I thought that there were several places like that. And there's some sound effects I put in. Right, I'd done the original stuff like that. That was fine. And came out to 23 pages. I remember reading a review of it at the time where some guy was kind of grousing because the new stuff didn't look like the old stuff and it wasn't as, I don't know, he didn't say compressed, a modern word for storytelling I don't care for much. Decompressed.
Decompressed, yeah.
Yeah, oh, buzz off. So, just tell your damn story. But what he didn't understand, what he didn't get was that for a silent story,
you have to.
Doing 10, 12, 15 panels on a page, it's not going to cut it.
Yeah.
You need to be able to hit each panel and get the meaning and then move on. And if they're larger, it's easier and faster to get the meaning. So as with Manhunter, when I did the original Manhunters, we were doing essentially 20-page stories in 8 pages. So I was doing 8, 10, 15, 20 panels on a page. And mostly they worked out pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the silent story, that wasn't the problem I had to solve. The problem I had to solve was make it silent and make the story clear. And so that called for me for a different approach to the graphics of storytelling. Mm-hmm. And that's why that story came out the way it did. But it came out well, and it made a nice circle with the original story, I thought.
The complaint about decompression is so dumb to me because like I think of that Ditko sequence where Spider-Man is lifting debris. That's
one of the greatest sequences in comics.
Exactly. And it's 6 pages of him lifting debris. Yep. It's as decompressed as it gets. And it's amazing. So
one of the stories is that when Stan got it, he was going, what am I going to write for this? I don't know if he really said that or not. That was the story. And I have to say, he wrote it great.
He wrote it great.
So, in fact, I parodied that in my frog story.
Yes, you did. With
with the frog
With
lifting the
Frog
hammer.
Thor
And
lifting the
I
hammer.
swiped some of the dialogue virtually verbatim in order to, within my body is the strength of many frogs, which Stan's line was, within my body is the strength of many men. If I'm not worthy for of whatever it was. So, but I did, yeah, I put little things like that in my comics occasionally. I do like comics that have humor in them, even
Yeah.
the grim comics. I mean, Ragnarok I'm doing now, which is a post Ragnarok comic, really, about my own version of Thor. Even in that, I have some humor, although it's probably grimmer than most of the books I've done, maybe any book I've done in the past.
When the enemies in Ragnarok converge and they have their meetings, I think it's hilarious.
Well, and they were all sort of, they have their own agendas. They don't all fit together. And I also like the character of Ratatusk. I like, he's got a little squirrel companion who I think is sarcastic and doesn't take Thor very seriously. And I mean, he gets it. And he kept Thor alive for hundreds of years. So as far as, Thor has to give him a pass. So he was not going to be a character in the book, a regular character originally. I was going to use him for the bit where we found out who Thor is still alive and how he's been kept alive by drinking the nectar from the apples of Iden that Ratatusk has been chewing up and squirting into his mouth, which I thought was pretty funny. But I just had that bit in mind. I didn't really have Ratatusk in there in my thoughts as a regular character. But one of the things that's nice about books where you've got a single character is that they need someone to talk to.
Yeah.
They either have a lot of interior monologues or they better have a companion they can talk to and explain stuff or have stuff explained. And so Ratatusk very rapidly became a regular character, a foil. Thor was his foil or he was Thor's foil. And he'll be in the book for a while.
Yeah. I want to say something more about Manhunter because
all right,
you won a bunch of awards for it, including the Shazam Award for Best Newcomer. And I feel that when I look at the overlying structure of your work, I feel that when you have panels coming out at you, I feel like you're taking that from people like Kirby. But I feel like with Manhunter, that's where you got that kind of mathematical precision in, because I feel like you do like a lot of right angles and a lot of and
I like geometry. I like straight planar geometry, maybe that and circles. I do a lot of circles.
I feel like with Manhunter, it's like I was reading it and I was like, there's like 20 panels on this page.
There are not every page by any means, but yes, yeah, there are some where it's really it was a real exercise to try to get all the information on. There's a fight between Manhunter and Asana Toby in the 6th chapter. It goes on for a few pages, and it's all a lot of fine panels, a lot of small panels. And Gil Kane critiqued that as having too many panels for the fight. The fight shouldn't have that many panels. And I thought, well, I like Gil. You're wrong.
There's a page in Star Slammers that has 125 panels.
Oh, I never counted them. But to be fair, it's like one big drawing and then a grid with a lot of little tiny heads here and there to kind of get to an effect. So it's not quite 125, but I know what you mean. So, well, like panels. I said once. I say stuff and I forget about it. Once it's out there in the world, I don't remember it because what's the point? But at some point, when I was talking to Howard Chaykin and I are good friends.
Yes.
And we was in New York, we would talk all the time. We lived together near each other a couple of times. Spent a lot of time together. Shot the breeze. Talked about comics. Talked about everything. And I made a remark at some point that comics. What did I say? Comics was like illustration with the addition of time. And Howard loved that. And it's all right. I mean, I still think it's true, but it's the panels that allow you the addition of time and allow you the moments of time that you put together to make something happen. It's not like movies where in a movie it's frame after frame. It gives the illusion of motion. You can get some illusion of motion if you blur the lines or there's ways you can achieve it, but it's not comics' main strength. It's not what it does well. But you break time down. One of the best guys I read, I do not remember their names, I'm very sorry, but the guys who did Lone Wolf and Cub, the 18 or 22 volume samurai story.
Kazuo Hoike.
Yes, thank you. And Archie had all those in Japanese, And when I looked at them some when I would visit his apartment. I lived not far from him. I looked through them, and I have to say that they didn't do a lot for me at that time when I read through. I looked through them. I didn't read Japanese. I just looked through them. Didn't do a lot for me. And then many years later, Dark Horse put out about 3 years worth of them, and then they quit. They were like comic book size, and then some years after that, they began putting them out in the digest size. My only complaint was I wish the digest was like an inch bigger. It's a little small for my old eyes, but nevertheless, they put out the entire series in English translation, and I read them all. And one of the things, I came to appreciate it far more than when I couldn't read it. And that's partly because their manipulation of time is not obvious, to me anyway, when all you have is the panels, but not the words. And there are moments in that book, now having hundreds of pages to work with gives you a much bigger range to play with time, but a bigger opportunity. But there are some moments where they stretch time out, and one thing will be happening and it will just take forever. And then other times where it's like bam, 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 like that, and where it's time is really compressed. And I was really blown away by the manipulation of time in that strip. That may be the best work of that sort that I think I've seen. Barry Windsor-Smith is awfully good at that. I haven't seen a 1,000-page epic from Barry or whatever. His new book's out.
His new book.
I'm gonna have to go find it. I have not seen it. I hope I can get a copy before.
Have you read what he said about you recently?
Somebody sent me that quote. I didn't know if the quote was accurate. They didn't send me the video. Well, actually, they didn't send me a link. I haven't watched it yet. I do want to watch it because I like Barry. I like Barry's work a lot. I'm a big fan of his work and his drawing and his storytelling.
Yeah.
Which is the part that I really respond to. But I had come across that, and I thought that was kind of funny. In some ways, I thought it was kind of sad. But at the same time, I kind of think that every artist comes to their work, has to explore and discover the way they come to their work when you begin from the beginning, when you can get to it. And it's not the same for everybody, whatever it might be. And if this is how Barry has to come to it in order to create this really brilliant work that he does, so be it. I'm not going to lecture him about finding joy in comics. I just think he should, if this is what it takes to get you to bring this kind of work out, I'm good with that.
I think you clearly do show a lot of joy in your comics because, I mean, you were already doing Thor in the 70s, being inked by Tony DeZuniga.
I did for a year.
And were there restrictions there? Because, you drew very differently a few years later.
Restrictions, maybe not. A part of it were a couple things going on. One was that my feeling about Marvel in the 70s, there are some exceptions. Starlin's Warlock is one of them. Warlock is one of them. Probably Paul Gulacy's, I think, Master of Kung Fu. His might have been in the 70s, toward the end of the 70s. But in the early to mid 70s, somewhere in there, I think myself, a lot of people had seen Jack leave Marvel and kind of felt he'd been screwed by Marvel because he had created so much material for them. Now, I think with Stan's help to a degree, I think Stan humanized Jack's concepts, which is something Stan's not often credited with. I think he made them accessible to a general audience in a way that Jack's own work wasn't always. But he'd created all this stuff and was not a stakeholder in any of it, and which was terrible. I think Disney may have settled some money in the Kirby family now, so maybe now that Jack's been dead for almost 20 years, you can't go back and undo time.
Yeah.
But he had left, gone to DC, and had no stake in all this stuff. And so there were a lot of comics at Marvel, the ones that I did. I mean, I didn't go to Marvel until 76, 77, 76 maybe for Rampaging Hulk. Maybe 75, early 70, late 75. I'm not sure. Rampaging Hulk was the first regular book I did there, I think. And I took over, did Thor. I did Thor for a year with Len Wein. Mm-hmm. And we, I don't know if it was partly Len, but partly I think it was what Marvel was about. a lot of people weren't that interested in creating all sorts of new characters because you could see where it was going to go, which is right into Marvel and not back any to you. And so there was a TV show when I was a kid, the Bell Telephone Hour. It was a science show. They did episodes. Wasn't a regular series. They just they did hour specials here and there and yon. And Dr. Frank Baxter was the bald-headed scientist who explained stuff. And at one point, they were talking about genetics, I think. And he had a big, I don't know what you call them. It's for gambling, where it's like an hourglass, except instead of being glass, it's a wire cage. There's one on top, one on the bottom, a little thin thing in the middle, and it's just like but you same thing with an hourglass. The bottom is full of they had them full of little poker chips with numbers on them, and they had red ones and white ones. And what they did, they had the same numbers you have chromosomes. And what they would do is they had them at the bottom, and they would like that, and then they would all fall through it and come out the bottom. And of course, it'd all be in a whole different pattern. And there were billions of patterns you could have made out of this same thing to describe sort of what happened with genetics. And but at the same time, in that, since the evolution wasn't and mutation wasn't incorporated into that particular model, what you had was a variegated pattern of the same basic stuff. And I think that's what Marvel felt like to me in the 70s. And I was part of it, where you went back and you used all this fabulous stuff Marvel had, but you didn't add a lot to it. I mean, you would add a story to it, you would change, but the Stilt Man would come back, or Blastar, whatever he was from the Fantastic Four. Loki, of course, would come back, the Destroyer. These were all guys. Len invented some guys and space guys in the beginning that Len invented, and I drew. So there was some new stuff, but a lot of it was the old stuff. And so I felt on that, the two things about that Thor. One, I thought we were turning that giant hourglass and getting a whole new pattern, but of pretty much the same elements, and then reforming them into new stories. And also for that work, I was just doing layouts. I wasn't doing tight pencils. In the beginning, because this is how I thought about the work at the time, John Buscema had gotten off the book. I took over after John, and I tried to.
How'd that feel?
A little intimidating, but when you're younger, you're more fearless. I would hate to do it now, but I tried to do layouts like John, especially the first couple of issues. I looked at a lot of John stuff and tried to kind of compose. I'm not sure I was very successful at it, but with Tony's, because what I wanted at that time, it's like my drawing these drawings in the 60s, where I tried to emulate. If I did Iron Man, it was a Gene Colan Iron Man. If I did Thor, it was a Jack Kirby, Vin Coletta Iron Man of Thor. And so I wanted issue 259, which was John, and issue 260, which was me of Thor, to be as seamless as possible. I was not trying to create an entire new look. We'd go, oh my God, what happened here? Now we do a lot more now. It's a lot like that. I don't think anybody tries to be like the guy that came before him, for good or ill. But I tried to do something like that. I went along and began doing more of my own stuff just in the drawing. For one thing, it was just took too long to go back and look at so much of John's stuff to imbibe more of it. So I just said, oh God, I'll just draw this. But they were layouts and finished by Tony. And when Tony was finishing it, I get my drink here. He was the guy that made the book look the way it looked. And he had been inking Buscema. So it didn't look all that different from the stuff that had gone before. I did take things from elsewhere. These aliens, I don't remember the storyline anymore. It was a giant wall in space and some other stuff. And the aliens, I think, had big eyes and little tiny chins before I'd seen manga. But it had some proportions like that. And these very long fingers that they had. And that was really, there was an illustrator named, I'm going to get this right, Harry Clark. I think it's Harry Clark, who was a Beardsley disciple, Aubrey Beardsley disciple. And he did Beardsley type stuff, but much more elaborate. It was really elaborate drawing and elaborate decoration and stuff like that. Very surreal, illustrated an edition of Poe that my parents had. So I'd loved his work from the beginning. And those And he had characters, ordinary humans, not aliens like I was doing. Had or characters who had these little tiny chins and wide heads and large eyes and very expressive, beautifully expressive drawing. And I saw the original ones. It was like this big. They're hugely detailed. I went, oh my God. I thought, oh yeah, it's going to be the size of my wall. No, it's not. He drew like this big. I was like, oh, geez. But so I borrowed a little Harry Clark in there. So I did take stuff from elsewhere, stuff I liked. But I tried, at least in the beginning, to have that book look like something that would not jar a reader from the preceding issue to my first issue. And so that was how I felt about it then. And also I was just doing layouts rather than type pencils. When I was doing the book in '83, by that time I'd kind of thrown that idea away. And also I was going to be drawing and inking it.
Yeah.
There was not a chance in hell I could look like John Buscema. It wasn't, not a chance in hell. So I'd better,
You're better off for it though.
I'd have been like a fifth-rate John Buscema, but I could be whatever it meant. I could be a first-rate Walter Simonson. So I just said, I'm just going to do this. And there were things that I did, for example, because I was doing a lot of mythology, and I didn't bother explaining it. Continuity is okay. I've said elsewhere, borrowed from P.D. James. Continuity is a good servant, but a poor master. And when you do stuff because it's got to fit the continuity, you're starting to strangle your stories. I don't care. So when I drew Asgard, Jack had drawn Asgard as this very science fiction-y towers and ramps and all sorts of stuff. Looked fabulous. And I had done that. I'd done that when I did the year's worth of Thor in the 70s. And something else about that, having done Thor for a year, I also took a lot of Jack in what I was doing, the layouts, tried to. I had done my Jack Kirby Thor.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I started in '83, I didn't feel I had to go back and do that stuff again. I'd been there, I'd done that, I'd taken stuff from it, and I was very free. I felt free to go on and do my own thing. Also, the book wasn't doing very well at the time, which was great for me because it meant that if the book tanked, nobody would blame me. They would say, oh, well, the book was tanking, poor Walt, couldn't save it. And if the book did well, they would say, wow, that Simonson guy is a genius. So, that worked out okay. But when I did Asgard, I did not do Jack's elaborate science fiction city. There isn't any Viking architecture that survived, whatever buildings they had, thatched buildings and stuff, turf buildings and stuff. But there are churches from when Christianity came into the North, right at the end of the Viking period. There are about 11, I think, at last I read. Maybe it's more than that, maybe it's not. They're called stave churches, and they have these steep roofs and multiple levels, and they're fabulous looking. They're all wood. They're fabulous looking. And so even though I was drawing a pagan city, I borrowed from church architecture. And I just figured this must be the way buildings kind of looked in the North at the time. So that's the stuff I used as the model for the Asgard that I drew. And I didn't have a story where, oh, look, a giant cosmic storm came through and knocked down all of Asgard and had to rebuild all the stuff in this new shape. Or I just, that's just a waste of space. That's a waste of story space. And, comics back then, 22 pages a month, that ain't that much. I'm just gonna do this, and you can go with it or not.
My favorite thing that you did with continuity was you introduced a completely different version of Odin's origin, and then a few issues later, Odin's grandfather is just like, so a giant eyeball told you this one time, and then your dad told you this. Who are you gonna believe? And that's it. Right. You resolved that continuity issue.
I mean, Roy did it the other way around with, so that there was a cycle, which is out of Norse mythology as well, a little differently, but it's somewhere in there. And I mean, I've had people, not for a long time now, but people who are angry at me for changing, what Roy had done. And I just feel it doesn't support it. That's not supported by a close reading of the material. Because if you read it, Thor gets a choice. And by implication, the reader gets a choice of whatever they want to believe. I didn't say, oh yeah, the eyeball was lying through its teeth. I just said, you got a giant eyeball? You got on one hand, this on the other hand, you choose. I did a thing like that in the Fantastic Four once, where I brought back, I implied that Dr. Doom had been off Earth for a long time.
Yeah.
And I gave him some new armor, which they got rid of the minute I was off the book. That's okay. That was Tom DeFalco, who was, I think, very wedded to like the old Lee Kirby stuff.
He did that with your Thor armor too.
Well, but I had a reason for it. Eventually went back to his own suit. It wasn't meant to be a new look forever. I mean, I didn't think Dr. Doom's look would be new either. But I had a thing there that implied that he'd been gone for a long time. And I had all kinds of people pissy about, oh, Simonson's thrown out all the continuity back to the Battle of Baxter building. He's got everything up back to FF40, blah, 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 blah. And, again, people who actually aren't reading it.
Yeah.
It's easier to believe your gut than actually have your mind figure stuff out and then say, oh, that's not what's really going on. What I did do was I tried to suggest that Doom came back to Earth once in a while. And in the end, you, the reader, are allowed to choose whichever appearances you think are really Doom, as opposed to Doombots. I was probably trying to solve the Doombot thing. John Byrne had Doombots, and there were so many of them, and Christoph was around. That it was like this giant Gordian knot of continuity.
Yeah.
And I thought, like Alexander, best way to do a Gordian knot, just cut it in half, get rid of it, and start going. And I really felt, I mean, certainly, if I had to choose myself, and I did not go through and make a list of the appearances I thought were real and were Doombots, but I would certainly never have gotten rid of any of the appearances that Stan and Jack wrote.
Of course.
Anything Stan and Jack wrote, as far as I was concerned, was canon. And then after that, you're on your own. But a lot of fans don't want to have to make their own choices. They want to be told, okay, this is canon, this isn't, and we can go from there. And I prefer saying, well, look, your choice is to, figure it out yourself, which is not always what anybody wants to hear.
That's the difference between fans and writers, though. Like, you guys, where we see plot holes, you guys see story opportunities.
Well, in some ways, I mean, I'm not too interested in going back. I mean, if I see story holes, I mean, like the stuff with the Doombots, that was such a big knot that I just figured I could kind of go through it. I did not want to go back and have to sort all of it out or do every story. So I'm cautious about old continuity. In some cases, like Asgard, I just changed it. I didn't bother explaining it.
Yeah.
In some cases, I mean, I do try to adhere to the continuity, but I don't really, as I said, I don't try to make it my master. I just try to, and I, if there's some place in an old comic where a guy got a no prize because somebody's costume was green instead of blue, I have no interest in doing a story that says, oh yeah, my blue costume's in the wash, so I had to wear my green costume that week or something. Come on. So it's just, what I really want to do is tell good stories, and all the rest of it is in the service of that. Whether I tell good stories or not is up to the readers.
Yes, you do. What changed your mind about creating things? Because you were just mentioning how it was in the 70s, but then your 1983 Thor comes out, and the first thing you do is you create somebody who lasts forever, Better Ray Bill.
Well, longer than I would have thought. Part of what happened was that around about 83, by the time I was starting, real before I started Thor, happened at the end of, say, 82, Marvel began giving royalties. So suddenly you became a stakeholder in your comic to a certain extent. You didn't own your characters, but if your books, and then DC did too, royalties came in at either the end of 82 or early 83, I don't remember. That meant that if the book sold well, you got some extra bucks. At that time, there are not as many comics as there are now. Most of Marvel Comics made royalties. Most DC Comics back then, I think, did not. A few did, but most didn't. And that meant, however, for either company, if you could gin up the sales for a book, you made more money. Whereas before that, it didn't matter what the sales were. I could be working on the worst selling book that DC had, and Kurt Swan could be doing Superman and selling a lot more copies. And our page rates aren't different. I mean, they were different. Kurt was making more money than I was, obviously, on a page rate. But it was a page rate. It was a minor difference. And it was a page rate that was not dependent on sales. So when royalties came in, that was actually very funny. I did a book called The X-Men Teen Titans.
Yeah.
Book in 82 with Chris writing it, Terry Austin inked it, Glennis Ween colored it, and or Glennis Oliver maybe by then, I'm not sure. And Tom Warzakowski lettered it. And we went to talk, I think Chris and I, maybe Terry, went to talk to Jim Shooter, the editor, about maybe getting a royalty on that book. because we knew it was going to sell like gangbusters. Didn't matter who was drawing it. I claim no credit for the book selling well. It
I
just
think it
sold
was
well.
the most popular of the 4 crossovers.
Oh
that
well, maybe that's
DC
more. That's
Marvel
more
did.
than I would have thought. Maybe the first Superman, Spider-Man would have been, but whatever.
It's one of
Anyway,
the 2.
the upshot was that we thought it would sell well, and that Marvel could afford to give us some royalties on it. Jim explained to us in some detail why royalties weren't possible, and essentially it amounted to, well, if we paid the freelancers royalties, the company would go bankrupt. There's just not enough money in comics to pay freelancers royalties. So, okay. So we went away. The upshot is that DC introduced royalties. And I think myself, you should have Paul Levitz on, something he could explain to you better. But at the time, the way the royalty system was structured, most DC books didn't give royalties. They didn't sell enough copies.
Mhm.
You know, sell more than 100,000 copies to make royalties. Most DC books sold a little less than that. Most Marvel books sold more. So I kind of feel that part of the impetus of that was that, you know, maybe they felt Marvel couldn't match that because it would cost them a lot of money. But it was certainly there was a lot of discussion among my friends and freelancers about going over to DC and working there because you had a shot at making extra money. You could get your books up and get going, go for it. And Jim and Mike Hobson and whoever else at Marvel, within a few days, they had put a royalty plan in place, something similar. And when that happened, my income went up by a third.
Wow.
That's quite a jump. That's the biggest
That's a
raise
big jump.
I'll ever get. Biggest raise I'll ever get. But it happened while Chris and Terry and I, and Glennis and Tom, were still doing X Titans. So by the time X Titans came out, the book that they couldn't afford to give us royalties on because it would bankrupt the company, we got royalties.
That's sweet.
And didn't do too badly. So it was just, so that was the way it was. So from then on, I didn't mind inventing stuff for Thor. I mean, I might have anyway. Eventually, you just want to do something different.
Mhm.
And there weren't a lot of games in town. There was not a lot of independent comics. There weren't a lot of other places you could go to take your ideas. But nevertheless, I didn't have to worry about it. The royalties came in, and then I just invented stuff. I invented, I used some of the old characters. I invented some new ones.
Yeah.
And book did pretty well. And that was my favorite Marvel comic in the old days. Iron Man, Spider-Man, EFF, and Thor were my 4 favorites of the original days of Marvel. And
those are the big ones.
Well, they were my favorites the whole back. And Thor was my favorite of those 4. So the chance to do Thor and write it myself was really a treat. And at the time, I think I'd written maybe about 10 comics. I was really a fledgling writer. I had worked with other writers where I'd helped plot stuff, made some dialogue suggestions as margins and notes in the margin, but I hadn't really written anything to speak of. And then I had a chance to write a few things. And so by the time Mark Grunwald offered me Thor, I had written, I'm going to say 10 comics, something like that. And so I was really again, I was young enough and fearless enough. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, so I took a lot of chances, and they actually worked out pretty well.
I feel like there aren't a lot of people who would have said that Stan and Jack's Thor was better than their FF, but I'm actually with you. I actually do like it. I do like it better than also.
I love the FF. That Norse mythology was just where that's where my heart is. So, and they did a nice job without being too Norse or too mythological. But actually, one of the things they did, I just saw somebody was giving me a hard time for this on the web. I'm thinking, this stuff's 37 years old. What do you give me a hard time for? Don't look at modern work, for God's sake. But they were cranky about, because I said, he said I was going to be doing Norse mythology. And the first thing he did was introduce Beta Ray Bill in science fiction. And I just went, you jerk. And I did that because I'm sure I never said, I did bring in more Norse mythology.
Yes,
but I'm sure
did.
I never said, I'm going to do it to the exclusion of all else. And one of the things I liked about Jack and Stan's original run was it jumped back and forth from mythology to science fiction.
Absolutely.
So
did yours.
Well, that's why.
Yeah.
So with the Recorder and the colonizers of Rigel and Tananile and Ego the Living Planet. It was all this kind of pulp science fiction-y stuff. It was great. And then they would go off and fight, mythological creatures, especially in the Tales of Asgard. But they would, or Fafnir the Dragon, or whatever it was. I was in Tales of Asgard. But they jumped back and forth, and I loved the dichotomy of Thor being a character. For me, Thor is a character in a comic that looks back to a mythic past.
Mhm.
It's one reason my layouts in that book are pretty straightforward, because I don't want to do comics from the 40s, small panels and most square, some round ones and stuff. But I want a kind of a conservative storytelling for that, because I feel that reflects the backward look of the book to a mythic past. So that's kind of how I try to achieve that graphically. When I did the Fantastic Four, that at the time I felt looked forward to a science fiction future at a time when you could still look at a future like that and be optimistic.
How
These
how
days, not so sure.
how many
And
people
so I
get
did loony
landmark runs
layout.
on?
What's that?
How many people get landmark runs on both the big Stan and Jack books?
Well, I'd like to have done more FFs, but Marvel was changing at the time when I was on it, and eventually I decided that I would have to move on.
I
I did a year and a half, which these days a year and a half would be pretty good.
It's
for
a long
doing
time.
like that.
It's a long time now.
All I hear now is, "Oh yeah, it was such a short run." I'm going, not by modern standards, pal.
We have you have one of the things that your makes your Thor run stand out, and it carries over in your Orion, in your in Ragnarok. I feel like with Stan and Jack, when they were doing Thor, they were doing Norse mythology, but I also kind of feel like they were putting their own background into it, which is a more
Oh yeah.
Jewish, Judaic, Odin very specifically. And even in recent runs, like Jason Aaron's run is very clearly him trying to work out his own issues with his faith. When I read your Thor and your Orion and Ragnarok, it is 100% Nordic.
Well, look, Simonson, grandparents are from Norway.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something there. I don't know. I only knew one of my grandparents. My grandmother was dead by the time I was old enough to know, but my grandfather lived to be an old guy, and I knew him a little bit. We never discussed mythology. But I just, I like mythology. I did a couple of courses in it when I was in school. One called, what was it? It wasn't Myth and Legend. Wasn't Myth and Science. But what it was a course by a guy it was about the change in Greek culture, where they went from sort of a mythological explanation of the natural world to a scientific explanation. Yeah. Now it wasn't science as we understand it, but the guys that the guy invented the name Adam, one of the Democritus, or one of the Greek philosophers, where he thought there'd be a little indivisible particle that would make up everything. And of course, Aristotle wrote all kinds of things some of which, like lighter objects fall less fast than heavier objects, weren't true. But he still observed the natural world and tried to wrestle with it without a mythological explanation for why stuff happened. So it was a course about the change from, in a sense, mythic philosophy to natural philosophy. I don't remember a lot about the course now, but it was still pretty cool. I read some books back then. There was a guy that wrote about kind of that transition and the meaning of myth in culture and what it meant when it was powerful and alive in the culture. His named Eliade. I read two or three of Eliade. We read one for the course. I liked it. I read two or three of his books. I should go back and read them again. That's been so long. But I just, I hesitate to say I don't have a faith to work out. I sort of don't. I think my grandparents settled in North Dakota. There was a big mass migration of the Scandinavians into Minnesota and North Dakota back in 1800s, and that's why my grandparents were part of that. And my granddad established a wheat farm in the middle of North Dakota, right below the Canadian border, and it was a large wheat farm. And he had 8 kids. They all reached adulthood, all grew up there. So my dad grew up on a farm, and they didn't have, I don't think they would have had churches around somewhere. There are graveyards there. You go to the graveyard, it's all Andersons and Simonson and all Scandinavian names. The old graves are all Scandinavian names. And Dad, we didn't talk about religion much, really. But the impression I got was that they weren't church going. At least my father wasn't. I don't know about my grandmother. Again, she was gone before I was old enough to. I was like 4 when she died, so I don't remember at all. And I don't know that Granddad ever went to church. But his dad said, you'd be out there in the fields, and North Dakota's flat. There's nothing but sky. Yeah. And so you'd be out there. In the early days, they ran horses to pull the plows and stuff. There's a nice photograph from my granddad, some of the farm hands at my granddad's farm. Look, a row of 20 horses that were used to pull the equipment. And then later, of course, it's all tractors. But you'd be out there, and you'd be out there in this flat country with nothing but sky to look at and your own thoughts to keep. And you kind of worked out on your own terms what all the stuff that religion deals with, what that really means. You might keep it a lot simpler than most organized religions, but you would reach an accommodation with living in a way that, as I said, I didn't really discuss with my father, but I think that's where he reached whatever inner feelings he had about that stuff came from those days out there with his own thoughts in his own time. And there were, you had, of course, back then, you had life and death in a way that we're not so accustomed to now. He spoke of one of his, it might have been an uncle, who was tall, 6'4". I'm going to say his name was Sigurd, which is a good Scandinavian name. I don't know if that's true or not. But he worked on the farm for a time, and he was out with the horses plowing. Dad would have been pretty young. Might have been before Dad was born even. And he was out with the horses plowing, or at a harrow maybe. And a thunderstorm came up. And he got off, Sigurd, I'll use that name anyway, got off the plow and got over and got in front of the horses and was unharnessing them so they could run free in the thunderstorm and get to shelter or whatever, keep moving. And there was a blast of lightning and thunder right close by, spooked the horses, and it pulled the equipment over him and killed him. So we had a couple stories like that, not so much about people being killed exactly, but there were stories like that where you were close to life and death in a way that I think made it a lot more immediate than most of us in the modern world, at least here in the United States, sitting in my studio with Wheezy in the next couple rooms over, talking to you in the Philippines, don't really appreciate in quite the same way. I've tried to keep that in mind, but the idea that there are, I don't know, forces beyond us. I just love the story about gods. Doesn't mean I necessarily believe in them. I don't see maybe a reason not to believe in them, but those kind of stories, with a mythic quality, not just as an explanation for how lightning works or Thor's hammer or any of that stuff, but just as a way of wrestling with the immensity of everything, seems like not a bad way to go. I don't have a lot of, I don't think about it a lot as in a like a rational way where I haven't tried to parse all this out carefully. And I'm pretty cool. Whatever anybody wants to believe, fine by me.
As long as you're not hurting anyone, people.
Well, that's kind of, what was it, Steve Gerber's? Play hard, play fair, and nobody hurt.
Yeah.
Didn't Howard the Duck wear a shirt like that, or somebody, one of those characters? That's Val Merrick would know. But that kind of stuff seems okay to me. And most of what I try to do is tell good stories. And that's, I don't know, I do keep in mind, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I'm doing this stuff now. I was a geology major in college before I got into art, before I began drawing comics. And one thing about geology is you deal with very long timelines.
Yeah.
So I have no illusions about being an artist with a capital A or whatever it would be. And I have no illusions any of my stuff's going to be around in a couple 100 years. maybe a lot less than that. And so just trying to do the best I can right now. And I said this once in one other interview many years ago. There's a movie, Ride the High Country, by Sam Peckinpah, with Joel McCrea and Randolph Scott. It's a couple of old, aging cowpokes who take on a gig to get some gold from point A to point B, and bad guys try and take it. A bunch of other stuff happens. I haven't seen it in a long time. But Randolph Scott, they don't have anything to show for all the years punching cows or being gunfighters or whatever they were. And Randolph Scott is tempted by the gold. This is more than they're ever going to make, more than they've ever made in their lives. And they could just disappear and live. And Joel McCrea is not going to do that. So they come into conflict on that. And at some point, Randolph Scott asked Joel McCrea, Joel McCrea's character, essentially, well, what do you want to be? Meaning essentially, poor or rich or, whatever. And McCrea's answer was justified.
Oh, cool.
And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
So I used that in an interview. That was my tagline for an interview once. I haven't used it since, but that's really, the work justifies itself, or it justifies me. We're all going to be dust in a few years anyway. So,
I mean, you're talking about not having illusions about your work lasting, but I say this with the utmost respect, and I mean this as a compliment. I started reading comics really in '86 when I was like 4, but I really started collecting them in the '90s. And by that time, Dargo was around, Thunderstrike was Thor. And so with the first time I ever read Beta Ray Bill, I didn't get the big deal. So you had created a framework that had become the template for so many things, to the point where I didn't get the big deal out of it until many years later. It's the same thing with X Titans, because you and Chris introduced the source wall.
That's right.
I didn't know that you had introduced the source wall. To me, it was just a thing that was always there.
Right.
And hopefully soon, because the new Disney Plus Loki show is going to be using the time variance authority, which, did you even think things would get to this level where you just...
No, I just did it. I did it for fun. I did it partly because I used those letters because I was born in Tennessee. I moved, my parents were living there at the time. My dad was working there. He got transferred to Washington, D.C. when I was about 2 2/3. And so summer of '49, I guess, we moved to D.C. But one of the things Dad would talk about from time to time, he was a scientist and traveled a great deal. And he was a soil scientist, studied soils, traveled all over the country. And he was a fan of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a program to bring electrification to rural areas that just didn't have it and weren't going to get it from the major power companies because it was expensive. So the government stepped in and they built dams on the Tennessee River and probably elsewhere, Fontana Dam, Norris Dam, and put in generators and electrified a lot of country in that area that was not electrified. Now, I haven't studied the history of the TVA, because that's the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's where those initials came from. And the Dad's version of it was that a lot of the power companies, the local power companies, weren't very happy about it because they charged less than the other power companies. So other power companies had to keep their prices down somewhat to compete with the TVA. And of course, it was a government program. So nowadays, I'm sure there'd be a certain number of political operatives who'd be appalled by the government stepping into this private enterprise. But my dad really liked it, and because he felt that it kind of leveled the playing field. And so I've always loved the Tennessee Valley Authority, knowing nothing about it other than what my dad told me. I could be completely off base. But as a result, I also love those initials. So I needed a time thing. And I love time travel stories. I love time stories in general. So I somewhere the Time Variance Authority came up as a name, and I was off and running.
You did some Doctor Who as well.
I did one cover and half dozen illustrations for the inside for an article. Joe Duffy, I think, who was a giant Doctor Who fan. I've never seen a Doctor Who.
Interesting.
But she was a big fan. And I know Tom Baker. I like Tom Baker. His
Yeah.
costume was great. I gave him the world's longest scarf.
Yeah.
But he, she was editing. There were Dave Gibbons stories, actually. At least the first issue was. I don't know about there were 4 issues, I think Marvel did. And so I did the cover for the first one. And there was I think she probably wrote it. I'm not sure. Joe, I'm sorry. I'm not sure about that. There was an article inside about it. And there were several shots of the Brigadier and other characters I'm not familiar with, but I had the visual reference. So I drew them for the article. And that was fun.
Scott Dunbier tells me, because he was one of my first guests on the show.
He was lying.
So,
I tell you right now, he was lying.
I said with Ragnarok, I honestly feel like you have gotten better and better with time. And then he said, yes, you have. And you share a trait that most great artists, with the most probable exception of Frank Frazetta, share, which is you are very unsure of your work. Is that true?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, that's true. It's like doing these X Factors because I'm trying to do them in a somewhat simpler look. I don't know how successful I was getting them done. I've gotten some good reviews. I got one review who said, it's really a shame Simonson didn't bring his A game to X Factor. And of course, you always remember the bad reviews more than the good reviews. So I'll remember that. It made me laugh. And I have to say that I don't have an A or B game. I just do what I do.
Yeah.
And maybe some of it comes out A work and maybe some of it doesn't. I don't know. But because I was trying to do some stuff differently, and there's at least one thing in the book that I wish I'd maybe designed differently. But I don't know how I would have designed it. And it actually worked out pretty well in the comic. So what I do find is that I'll do the work. I mostly don't like what I've done. I'll look at it and go, man, I mean, it isn't like I had something in my head and saw it on the paper and I just didn't make it, but it still doesn't seem to be as good as I had hoped it would be or whatever. Rarely it is, but that's extremely rare. But what does happen is that a lot of times when time has gone by and 6 months, a year and a half, I assume it's enough time. So whatever vision I had in my head for that work is gone. I don't look at my old stuff and remember, oh yeah, I remember inking these lines. I look at it and go, Jesus Christ, what the hell was I thinking? Or I think, how did I put all these lines in? How did I get all this texture in here? I see some stuff where it's just like nuts.
There's a lot of stuff like that in Ragnarok.
There's a lot of stuff like that. I'm not as fast as I used to be by a long shot, but I will find when I go back and look at it a year later or a year and a half later, it's better than I remember. It's not always as good as I'd hoped, but mostly it's better than I remembered it being, which is comforting. And I go through a phase. Wheezy was the one who discovered this, or who figured it out. I'll be working, I'll be drawing, and suddenly, can I use 4-letter words in this show?
Sure.
Beep. Suddenly, I can't beep draw anymore. I can't fucking draw anymore. Drawing sucks. I'll redraw something 6 times, it won't come out. And I think, I've been drawing for a half a century. Well, I've been drawing longer than that. If you go back to when I was a kid, I've been drawing longer than that. I can't fucking get a hand to come out right. What is that about? And I'll have a few days like that where it's just awful. And then it kind of planes out. I'm a little better. And Wheezy figured out, because she would see me doing this at close quarters, that what it usually means, and I could see it looking back, those moments when a few days, whatever it is, where I suddenly can't draw, my drawing isn't substantially worse than it was, really. Mm-hmm. But I think what happens, this is how I interpret it anyway, is that my eye has made a jump to seeing stuff I wasn't seeing earlier. Mm. But my hand hasn't gone through my brain, gotten scrambled, and then come out of my hand when I'm sitting there drawing away. And it takes a few days or a week for the kinesthetics of the motion of my hand and my eye and my brain to all coordinate. So that frequently, I mean, it doesn't happen that often now. I kind of wish it did. But what it means is I can see that the work I did after those moments is better than the work I did before. So it's really a moment where I've made a step to get a little better. Now, when you're young, those steps are enormous. I used to compare it when you graph it. Here's your XY coordinates. And when it's coming up, you're getting better. It's shooting straight up right along that Y coordinate. And then as you get older, it begins to plane out toward the X coordinate and goes out that way. And my only hope is that, it's going out to infinity. So I'm hoping that gradually I'm getting closer and closer to the X coordinate as I approach infinity.
This analogy makes me so happy. I
love
love
don't
this stuff.
know. And I don't know. I mean, there are, there are some artists, we all have, I'm not going to go into all of it, but, there are some artists who formularize their work to a point where, you recognize it, it's really good, but it doesn't explore much of anything.
Yeah.
After decades have gone by. I'm sure it's happening to me as well. There are things I do where I get drawing hands where you go, oh, Jesus, I drew hands better in 1973 in Manhunter.
Aren't hands the hardest thing to draw anyway?
I think it's possible faces are harder than hands. You got a really good face, especially full of expression.
Okay.
To make it really communicate. But hands are right up there, yes. So, but by this time I've drawn billions of hands. You think I'd be able to go zip, 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 and I'm done. And I still have I got a mirror right beside my board right over here. I still look in it when I'm drawing, trying to figure out how to get something to work properly. But I haven't, what I have tried to do, or maybe what I haven't tried to do, I have tried as much as I can not to formularize, say, the human figure. It does mean there are times when I could kick myself because I have friends who would go zip, 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 and it would just be done and it would look great. And I would think, oh, you schmuck. But then I also feel that every time I draw it, I have to reinvent it or I have to re-explore it. And it keeps the work interesting, if annoying. That's a part of my work that's not the joy. Barry may have said that, but it's not every piece of work I do. But I end up having to, or I try to kind of reinvent stuff from time to time, just the way I'm drawing, because it keeps it interesting. I do not want to end up, if I reach the point where I'm thinking, oh, I've done this a million times, and a lot of graphic solutions, you draw them and you think, oh, I have done this a million, or some solution you've done a million times. My hope is that when I get back to that same problem I have to solve, I'll solve it a little better than the last time I did it. And I can see myself drawing wrists in a certain way or this or that, but I still try to figure out maybe some little different way to get at it. So I use a lot of reference. I look at a lot of books, a lot of body. I had this book from a million years ago. I still use it. It's totally fallen apart. It's Bodybuilding All-Stars with this is Frank Zane in the cover, I think. And it's got Schwarzenegger. It's just a bunch of the champion bodybuilders over the years. And some of them, I don't try to draw it was Frank Zane. I don't try to draw these guys exactly, but I want to look at the anatomy. I want to rethink. They're all lit differently, and I want to rethink it. I'm not a chiaroscuro guy so much. I'm more a line and shape guy. But it's the effort is to try to keep the work fresh over the decades, and whether that's successful or not going to be up to me to say. But that is kind of what I'm reaching for is an unattainable goal. I'm reaching to try and keep improving, but just not do the same thing over and over again, even though, of course, I am doing the same thing over and over again.
I remember seeing the preview for Ragnarok, seeing that double page spread with Thor and Jormungand, and thinking, how did he just do this? Because he's already done a whole thing with Thor versus Jormungand that's all splash pages 30 years ago, and now he did it again with something that looks completely different.
Yep.
How do you separate the two versions of Thor in your head? Because despite the name, and despite the hammer,
mine has no jaw, no lower jaw. It's really The stories are different. When I is the milieu is different. It's much more Nordic. I'm not going back and doing science fiction stuff. I mean, the nature of the stories is quite different, and that really dictates. I don't know if it's a different approach to stories, but the stories themselves are different. Like I don't know that I would do a story where I would turn Thor into a frog in this.
Not in this one.
Ragnarok. Probably, I'm not saying I couldn't reach a point.
Do have a talking squirrel though.
But I have a talking squirrel. But he was a talking squirrel in the Norse myths.
Yeah.
In the Norse myths, there's a giant, well, Yggdrasil, the world tree, and there's a dragon at the bottom, Nidhogg, serpent at the bottom, Nidhogger, and there's a giant eagle in the branches. I don't know if it probably has a name. I don't know the name. And Ratatusk would run up and down the trunk, and it would run up to the eagle, and the eagle would trash talk the serpent, and Ratatusk would run down the trunk, and it would relay to the serpent what the eagle had said, and the eagle would trash talk. Nidhogger would trash talk the eagle, and Ratatusk would run. So he was basically a carrier of bad mouthing back and forth, and that's all. That's the only story he's in, as far as I know. So I love the idea. There may have been other stories he was in. I have no idea what the significance of that story is. I'm not sure what he does, but it's hysterical. It's a hysterical idea. And so that's why I thought he should be kind of a smart ass. He's got slightly broken language because his brain is smaller than a human being, but he's a sharp cookie, and I think a sarcastic one, and a lot of years spent carrying trash talk up and down this giant tree. Well, you learn a lot. So you learn a lot about trash talking.
Are there more plans for Ragnarok? And also,
yes.
For a while, for quite a long time, your lettering was so big it was such a big part of your graphics that I actually thought John Workman was you under a pen name.
Oh, well, John was the guy I discovered who could letter the way I letter, but better. And it was thrilling. I didn't have to do it anymore. Weezy's not happy how I letter because she feels it's not cost effective. I have to go back and practice so much that it's just not worth doing. I did letter some of my really early stuff. I did do all the display lettering up until Alien. But John and I worked together first on the Alien graphic novel in 78, 79 really, first third of 79. And John was the art director at Heavy Metal. He was the guy that got me the gig to draw the adaptation of the Alien movie. And I suggested Archie as a writer, and that worked out really well. It worked out beautifully. So John lettered that, and in doing so, I discovered a guy who could letter beautifully. And the kind of lettering I would like to be able to do. And so the sound effects we have now, John does almost all of them. Once in the blue moon, I will do one. In some cases, well, in the last Manhunter story, where there was no dialogue, John had no job. I mean, I could have gotten John to letter it, but I lettered the original Manhunter, the display lettering. I didn't do the balloons, but I did do the display lettering. I did actually on the Manhunter, anything back then before John, if I inked it, I drew the panel borders. I drew the borders around the balloons, all the borders around the captions, and all the display lettering. Letterers love doing my stuff because it was a simple job. Do the small letters, you're done. And but I wanted it. It came out of my art school training, I expect. I wanted those shapes. I mean, lettering is really shapes inside in your panels. Yes. The balloon is a shape, a positive shape inside your panel. And I am such a shape guy. I wanted the balloons to be part of the shapes I was drawing, rather than something different, to reflect my own hand. I was willing to let the lettering go, but most of it, not the display lettering. But that's why I went ahead and did all the balloons themselves, the lines around them. And so, and that's true. Any job I inked up to like 79. The Metal Men, I actually lettered the first issue of the Metal Men. I did, I think, just the first issue, the whole thing. And after that, other guys lettered it. But I got John. I discovered in John a guy that could do what I wanted to do. So what I do now is on a page, like I say, in a Ragnarok or back on Thor. When I'm writing it, I put trace paper over the artwork and indicate on the trace paper where I want the balloons. I number them all, and I number the scripts. And John has this numbered script and the indication of where I want the balloons placed. And if I have a sound effect, I'll just draw a box like a long horizontal box, in the position I want it in, whether it's bleeding off the side, like off my screen, or off over here, or this way, or whatever. And usually I have a lot more letters in the sound effect than John can squeeze in. So he is free to drop out whatever letters he wants to squeeze everything in the space he's got to work with.
That's why it looks so seamless.
So that's what's going on there. That's why and actually one of the nice things about this job for Marvel, the X Factor job, is that Marvel let me get it lettered on the boards by John.
Cool.
And the computer lettering to me mostly looks like sound effects, maybe not as much, but the regular lettering looks like it's like a layer sitting on top of the art mostly, which of course is what it is. And it isn't integrated into the art as effectively as stuff used to be. So I prefer old school as long as I can do it. And the companies let me do it.
And after 3 books, what is in store for Ragnarok?
Thor goes to Jotunheim next. I'm still getting the plot worked out for that. I've done a lot of other stuff. And the trouble is I have a lot of ideas for it. So I don't know if I want it to end up being 2 6-issue arcs to get all through. I don't know if people will be interested enough in Jotunheim to stay there for 12 issues.
You know, you haven't shown Loki yet.
No,
even in flashback, we like see the back of his head.
Well, in the on the very first splash page, the first page of the first issue, the 2 big figures in the foreground, one's leaping on top of the other, coming down with a sword, and one's guarding up, and that is Loki and Heimdall. In the myths, they kill each other. Yeah. They are apparently some kind of serious foes in the way that Odin and Fenris Wolf and Thor and Jormungand. Loki and Heimdall are apparently a pair of some kind. We don't have any stories about that, but they kill each other. And so that's those 2. That's why I really drew Loki. I drew Loki and Heimdall in that one shot. And beyond that, I'm not really at liberty to say. I'm still working actually on some of those ideas. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm working out the plot. I may have one more comic to do for Marvel. That has to be decided still. And I've got a few commissions to finish up. So I'm going to do those commissions and then I'll wrap it up.
Awesome.
And then I'll go back to Ragnarok. So it'll be a while before I get back to Ragnarok. Longer before it comes out next year sometime, before it actually begins coming out again. But
it's awesome.
I just can't go any faster.
Thank you, Mr. Walt Simonson. This was an awesome interview. I learned a lot.
It's been a pleasure. 2 hours and 10 minutes or something like that. Whatever, maybe 2 hours, whatever it's been. But thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. A lot of fun.
Much. Tell Tintin I said hi. And
I will.
Or she'll see this, Tintin. Hi.
I'm sure.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for putting all my books up behind you.